Johannesburg residents are being encouraged to be mindful of their water usage. Level 1 water restrictions are in place across the city. Now, this is in addition to regular calls to limit their electricity usage. I don't know how much more we can take. Some suburbs are facing complete water shortages, while others are dealing with water disruptions, placing an additional burden on residents. We are now joined by water expert Prof Anthony Turton to clarify the situation. Prof, good morning. Thank you for your time. I do want to ask you, what in your opinion seems to be the problem? Is this a leadership crisis? Is it failing infrastructure? Is it that there is no water? What are we dealing with?
Yes, good morning to you and the listeners. What you're dealing with now in Johannesburg has been happening in Durban, been happening in Port Shepstone, it's been happening in other parts of the country, it's been happening in East London. It happened a while ago, a couple of years ago in Cape Town. So it's a national crisis. It's not a local crisis at all. And at the heart of it all, it comes down to a failure of our institutions, the failure of your decision-making structures that do long-term forecasting, long-term planning. And at the very, very heart of it, it goes back to 1994 when we became a democracy, when a decision was made to separate water services from water resource management. Water resource management is water in the rivers. Water services is water in taps and pipes. And basically, the responsibility for long-term planning was taken away from the Department of Water Affairs at that point in time and placed in the municipal departments where they'd never ever had any experience of doing this before. So it's the inability to do long-term forecasting, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to a leadership crisis. Where you have an unstable coalition government in a local municipality, unable to reach agreement, unable to allocate portfolios, unable to take responsibility. How can you expect the departments that those people are supposed to control, how can you expect them to do adequate forecasting? So this is an absolute failure of Johannesburg municipality and nobody else.
And Prof, I like that you mentioned the instability, the political instability that we've seen in the city of Johannesburg. We've had I think more than 10 mayors in the last 2 years or so, which is absolutely, atrocious in terms of the fact that the executive always changes in terms of that. So nobody ends up taking responsibility because they always say, no, but I've been here for only 2 weeks, ask somebody else, etc. But it's also an issue about capacity, right, Prof Turton? You spoke about not having the professionals in the municipality to actually deal with this crisis.
Well, how do you build that capacity? See, there's this notion about we don't have capacity, but we've never had capacity ever. I mean, capacity is something that is driven by demand. If there's a demand for capacity, then capacity flows in to fill that demand. So there's a demand for capacity, but there are constraints on building that capacity. When NASA placed the man on the moon, they didn't have the capacity to do that at the time. They built that capacity. So we have to do the same here now. But so we need to ask, what are the constraints on that capacity building? And of course, I would also like to just put into focus that image that you had just now of that JoJo tank in the background. Well, that's a powerful image because that tank was procured by somebody. So there's a procurement supply chain there, and that tank has to be filled by somebody, a tanker service provider. And therein lies your malady, because you've now got a thriving business there. And we see, for example, in KZN, where you've got the emergence of the tanker mafia. These people actually sabotage systems in order to get the tender services. We saw that recently playing out at the Rooiwal wastewater treatment works with a cholera outbreak, where there were tanker services being offered there. So this tanker service provision is starting to take root in South Africa. We see it also in the sewage side, where criminal elements sabotage the sewers and then go and make money by renting to the affected people a sewage pump. So in other words, we've got this criminal element, and in my professional opinion, we are starting to see this increasingly manifest as a national security issue. It's not just a water supply issue. It's not just a human rights issue. It's now becoming an economic development and job creation issue. And ultimately, it's becoming an issue of social instability and therefore national security.
Prof, as you just said, this has far-reaching consequences. We heard some of the residents saying that it's affecting healthcare, it's affecting the education of their children. You are now saying that there's also criminal elements involved here. far-reaching consequences, but this problem has been coming a very long way. Do you think we're at a point where we can still turn it around, where government can still turn it around, or is this an issue we need to be considerate of when we cast our votes next year?
Look, I'm known not to pull my punches, so I call it the way I see it. And I think what you have now is a situation where the ANC is in power, but they're not in control. And I think this is an important thing now. We're seeing the manifestation of misdiagnosed problems, which are now being solved with inappropriate solutions. So if the misdiagnosed problem is, for example, low pressure, then the solution now becomes to provide a tanker. So we've got to diagnose those problems correctly. And until such time as we do that, we're not going to find our way out of this thing. So in my professional opinion, we are dealing with a failure of the state. The systems have failed. They're not going to fail. They have failed, because they're designed to provide services to a high level of assurance, and they're allowed to break down in terms of the engineering design. They're allowed to break down twice in 100 years or once in 50 years. They're now breaking down at least once or more than once a year, and in many cases they're breaking down once a month. Here in Port Shepstone, we get water sometimes for a week a month. We're happy if we get water here in the Ugu district.
Yeah.
So in other words, what's happening in these smaller towns is now starting to be felt in the bigger city centres, and we must learn from what's happened in those small towns, where there's been a depopulation of businesses. Businesses are unable to thrive there, so there's been a massive loss of jobs, growing poverty, unemployment, growing social unrest, and that is just starting to spill out all over the show. So that's what it's all about. At the end of the day, water is an economic enabler. Water is the foundation of social stability. This is profoundly a political issue, and I personally don't think that that government, as is currently constituted, will be able to solve it. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying that what's happening in the energy sector now, where 3 years ago you had Gwede Mantashe saying that it is illegal to sell electricity into the grid by a private service provider, now it's become legal in 3 years. I think exactly the same is going to happen in the water services sector now. You're going to start seeing the emergence of independent water producers, ISPs, independent service providers, and if you happen to be on the coast, you're going to start seeing large-scale desalination attempts being made, etc. As private entities, public-private partnership type of entities. That's where we're going to in the future of South Africa. How that will affect Johannesburg is another matter, but Johannesburg's fundamental problem is that Johannesburg Water loses about 50% of the water that Rand Water gives it. It gets lost in liquid pipes. So that's entirely a domestic issue, and that's someone must be held accountable for that at the end of the day.
Yeah, and Prof, for me also, what you've just said now with our electricity supply and now water supply, that everything is going to go into a private, and public partnership worries me, because the private sector obviously naturally will concentrate on profit, and that means that those in the rural areas, etc., will probably suffer even more, and they are already suffering now. But my last question to you, Prof, the CEO of Rand Water, Sipho Musai, there's obviously this back and forth blame game between Rand Water and Joburg Water. He spoke about 46% of water that is lost in 18 municipalities because of poor infrastructure. But I want to ask you about this 4%, non-revenue water. What does that mean? He says that's the elephant in the room. Obviously, when we see 4%, it looks like a small number. But maybe if you explain to us as a professional, what is it and why he says it's the elephant in the room?
Yes, well, non-revenue water is water that has been sold by Rand Water to the receiving municipalities. So whatever that unit is, there's a certain volume that's been sold. There's a meter at the end of that pipe where the municipality receives it. Now, they then have to onward deliver it, because they retail. Municipalities are retailers of water. Rand Water is the wholesaler of water. So the wholesaler supplies to the retailer. The retailer now has to distribute that, but they've got to now collect the bills from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Must now be effectively billed. And we all know what the billing crisis has been like over the last 2 decades, in the city. So when water is unaccounted for, it means that it's been received, but we don't know where it is. So it's either leaked out of a pipe somewhere, or it has not been invoiced. Or the meters have been bypassed. We know what's happening in Eskom, where people bypass the electric meters and they steal electricity. The same happens with water. There's lots and lots of illegal water connections. And what that means this is the important thing I'm going to tell you now, is what that means is that for all the unaccounted water, there's no revenue coming into the municipal coffers. Therefore, the municipality is increasingly becoming bankrupt. Therefore, the municipality cannot pay Rand Water, but because Rand Water sells to many, many, many different municipalities, that is multiplied in Rand Water's balance sheet, and ultimately Rand Water will become bankrupt. So either the fiscus will go and bail out Rand Water again. And remember what happened to SAA. Exactly the same story. We had to keep bailing out SAA until eventually we couldn't bail out SAA. And the same thing's happening to Eskom as we speak now. We can't continue to bail out Eskom, and exactly the same will happen to Rand Water and all of the other water boards in South Africa.
Right,
so in other words, we must learn from this, because there are no free lunches. At the end of the day, the taxpayer will pay somewhere along the line, and ultimately the services will fail, and that is not in our collective best interest.
All right, Prof, thank you very much for speaking to us, Professor Anthony Turton. And generally for me, what he said about the public-private partnership or the private sector having to deal with all of this and everything that he's mentioned, even SAA, all our parastatals so far, it means that, why do we vote then if at the end of the day it's going to be the private sector that offers the services that we trust government to actually make sure we get?
Absolutely, so crucial. And I think all these conversations lead me to one conclusion. We need to think carefully, we need to read carefully and listen carefully before we can cast our votes next year.